Welcome to the King Exchange. I'm your host, Sean King. Today we are looking at a case with the numbers so damning and the story so explosive that it has to be front and center. Joining me today to break down all of this, the sharpest panel in media, David Washington, Kellen Clark, and Devin Dufresne. Buckle up. We have a lot of ground to cover. The demand for heat. For years, we have been told a very specific story about America. We've been told that we are a nation deeply divided by an inescapable rising tide of right wing hate. And whenever the left needed ultimate proof of this narrative, they pointed to one event, the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. The tiki torches, the chanting, the tragic violence. Charlottesville became the founding myth for a $1 billion political machine. It launched presidential campaigns. It was weaponized to convince the American public that white supremacy was lurking around every single corner. But what happens when the demand for hate outpaces the supply? You manufacture it. This week, the Department of Justice drops an 11-count indictment against the legacy civil rights giant, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. The DOJ alleges that between 2014 and 2023, the SPLC secretly funneled more than $3 million of donor money directly to leaders of some of the most notorious hate groups in the country. According to the indictment, they were cutting checks to the KKK, the United Klans of America, the Aryan Nations, the Nationalist Socialist Party of American Nazis, and the Sadistic Souls Motorcycle Club. Now, the SPLC is denying the claims. They say they're going to fight this in court, arguing that they've used sources within hate groups since the 1980s to gather intelligence and ostensibly bring them down from the inside. But intelligence gathering is one thing. Bankrolling, the defining symbol of American extremism, is another. The indictment details how a paid SPLC informant was sitting in the leadership chat planning the Unite the Right rally. This organizer was paid $270,000 to coordinate transportation and ensure turnout. And those vile racist posts on Discord about running over protesters, the DOJ says that they were made under the direct supervision of the SPLC, almost a month before a young woman was tragically killed by a car. Let that sink in. The same organization putting conservative groups on a hate list, the same group acting as the definitional gatekeeper for censorship and debanking, was secretly subsidizing the KKK. They paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure the turnout at Charlottesville was strong enough to terrify the American public. And the mainstream media swallowed it whole. They spun deceptive edits of Donald Trump's very fine people on both sides remark into a national hysteria, a hoax that politicians like Joe Biden and Barack Obama are still repeating to voters today. I look at the data, I track how audiences are built and how narratives spread. The SPLC built a billion-dollar empire by manipulating the data, acting as the watchdog for a threat they were actively underwriting. America doesn't have a rampant, homegrown hate problem. We have a grift problem, and the SPLC just got caught. All right, so let's bring in the panel now. David Washington, founder and CEO of J&N Washington and Door to Door I4 Incorporated, with over 35 years of experience decoding human behavior and political strategy. David understands the deeper psychological motivators of the electorate. He's here to help us analyze the why behind the SPLC's alleged manufacturing of political narratives. Also joining us is Kellen Clark, Operations Director at J.N. Washington, a University of Central Florida graduate focused on the intersection of law, media, and reform. Kellen is a pivotal force in driving public outreach and governance improvement. He'll be breaking down how this indictment shatters the public's trust in the institutions meant to protect them. And last but not least, Kevin Frayne, social media associate at JN Washington, a future campaign strategist currently studying at UCF. Kevin acts as the pulse of the network's outreach to emerging demographics and the next generation of voters. He'll be weighing in on how this scandal is resonating across digital landscapes and social feeds. All right, so let's get right into it. So, David, we know how the media ecosystem functions, and when an organization's entire revenue model depends on keeping the public terrified, how much does this indictment expose the mainstream press, which amplified the SPLC's hate maps for years without ever checking the receipts?
Hello, everyone. And I think this goes deeper than the responsibility for our media to ask the tough questions and to question the data and the source of that data. It goes deeper because this speaks to how nonprofits operate, and in the Southern Poverty Law Center situation, they needed a boogeyman to stay relevant and to keep the revenue coming in. And it appears that allegedly they fed the boogeyman and they allowed the boogeyman to persist bigger than what was known or what was typically accepted as, racism as an issue or as a threat to America. I'm sure that the United States used data from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I believe there are statements to the effect of our past administrations to say that the greatest threat to America is racism, is white privilege, is Christian nationalism, and things like that. And so this doesn't bode well for Southern poverty. It doesn't bode well for legacy media, and it doesn't bode well for nonprofits in general.
I mean, this actually does not come as a shock or surprise to me. I just think back to BLM, for instance, and what a scam that actually was, and the front that they put up, and that money not going towards the actual causes that they said it would go towards, rather, being paid themselves and advancing their, themselves. So this I thought was just waiting to happen, honestly. And what is incredibly infuriating is how the politicians and the media just kept running with it without actually
Yes.
being curious enough to maybe look into it a little bit further. What's most interesting is also how incurious the media actually is in this country. And that's something that I don't think is a coincidence either when you look who is paying the media, who's paying these organizations. And Kellen, politicians like Joe Biden, cited Charlottesville as, a foundational reason to run in 2020. And we've seen Democrats repeat the very Black people hoax on the campaign trail countless times. How does the Democratic establishment pivot now? That they're defining event for their fight for the democracy narrative, and was allegedly subsidized by a left-wing watchdog.
Yeah, that's it's going to be a tricky one because the thing is that if an action or a story or a narrative is found to be impure. And by impure, I mean it wasn't exactly the way it was 100%. Like, for example, like what happened at Charlottesville did still happen, right? The people who did those horrible things still did do those horrible things. There are still elements to the story that are very real, but now it's muddied because now we know that the organization of it was muddied, which means it probably got blown up a little bit more than it would have been. It maybe a little bit, maybe a lot of it. It's kind of hard to say. But now, because that component of it is a hoax, most of the public will find every single part of it to be one. So as far as going back to Charlottesville, like they probably can't, they shouldn't realistically ever do that anymore, because now, it has that thing associated. Now they could still, in a sense, lean on the overarching issue, because there are other things you can draw from. The Charlottesville was chosen not because it was the only example, but because it was the best, right? It was like the perfect storm for people who had, that kind of ever wanted to portray that aspect of America, because it was huge, it was impactful, there was all kinds of groups there, and it did a lot of damage, right? It was just this huge event. But now, if they're going to be going on the narrative, they're not going to be able to lean on that one event anymore. They'd have to pivot to some new locus or some new angle to it. It's definitely and it's definitely going to be a big impact, like, going forward. And when we're talking about media being uncurious, that doesn't surprise me at all, and not because of like a payroll thing, but because right now we run on a 24-hour news cycle. Journalists rush through every story in and out. No wonder it didn't get investigated this hard, and no wonder it's only getting investigated the way it is now, right? Well, I think the DOJ was interested because they were hoping to find something, which unfortunately has become a normal thing, not just in this administration, from the past one as well, and the one before that, of using the DOJ to try to sniff out politically advantageous indictments, right? The idea is that you could go back, you could go to some political opponent or some organization, and you just start by looking at those, right? What would be the most politically volatile group to be guilty of something, and you look into it and you see if you find something. Most of the time you don't, but it seems in this case they did. So I'm not surprised that the FBI would look into something like this. Not the FBI, the DOJ. It seems like, and from what I can see, it looks like they did find something. It's definitely going to damage a lot of public trust going forward, especially in a time where people are already trusting nonprofits less and less anyways.
But I feel like at a certain point, it's good that they were looked into. I mean, I'm looking at an article right now out of the New Republic by Matt Ford, and he writes that the Justice Department sides with the KKK. The administration's vindictive targeting of the Southern Poverty Law Center is yet another mask-off moment. So, again, it's like framing it almost as if like, oh, like they're just like targeting the SPLC and we don't care what they actually uncovered. It's just like they're doing this to almost justify the Unite the Right and say, well, they were on their side anyway, and this was happening. So, it has something.
They have to justify this, and it's because it feeds the coffers of legacy media like MSNBC or MS Now, as it's called, or the New Republic or Mother Jones or whatever. They need organizations like the SPLC to do what they do so that they can publish on television, in newspapers and magazines how horrible things are, how racism is rampant in America, how it's a threat to our national security. And that's shameful in itself. What we're seeing now, and Sean, I'm glad you did bring up BLM, Black Lives Matter, and how that's been proven to be a farce. The ladies there were blatant in their use of the funds for the wrong purposes, and they did really well for themselves. And this is, and BLM is just a national example of what's going on statewide and locally across America. And one more thing, this is incredibly shameful, as I was saying, off camera, as it relates to Charlottesville. A young lady by the name of Heather Heyer died. She was hit and run over by the racist who ran through the crowd with his car. And every year on the anniversary of her death, JW posts on X a memorial to her. And over those years, I've looked at her family, whatever's available on the internet about how her family's doing, what the family's doing, and to remember her by. And there was a fund that was set up in her honor, in her name, Heather's name, to promote, a better understanding among people and more love and that kind of stuff. And I believe that fund, just ended because it wasn't, it didn't have the financial means. But then with this particular situation, with the SPLC funneling money through their PACs to informants or people that they contracted with through, the KKK or whatever, and raising all this money, unbeknownst to their donors, that this money was going towards fomenting the hate, is disgraceful. Allegedly fomenting the hate, allegedly. And this is disgusting. It's disgusting. And the sad thing is that the thing that I'm angry about is that I've seen it. I've seen it over my 35 years in and out of politics.
Yeah.
And it persists. It persists in Illinois. It persists here in Florida, whether it's Chicago or Orlando. It persists, and people make their living off of donations, off of public funds in these nonprofits to continue the hate, to continue the social ills that plague America, like homelessness. It's a money generating machine.
And that's why I mentioned in my opening monologue, we don't have a white supremacy or racism problem as our biggest threat, or even a threat at all to our country, as a lot of Democrats like to suggest. I think that we have a grifting problem, and that exists on both sides. But we're looking at the SPLC today, and Kevin, the organizer, the SPLC's paid organizer, was making posts about running over protesters, and 26 days before Heather Heyer was killed by a car. At what point does monitoring extremism cross the legal line into criminal incitement and civil liability for the violence that actually occurred?
All right, so in order to address that, I feel like the big issue that I have with the SPLC allegedly did is that they're not like a government institution, because informants are pretty common. Like what they did, I don't think is all that surprising. I mean, you have information you want to gather, you pay informants. This is what the FBI has been doing for their entire history. I mean, the FBI had a contract with the SPLC since like the 80s, and they've done very similar things. However, when the FBI does it, there's kind of a general assumption that if like things go wrong, which again, you're paying people that have abhorrent ideologies, you're giving them money, maybe they're on your payroll, but that doesn't mean that you control what they do with that money. Like they're giving you information, but they're doing it for the most part, I would say, out of like personal gain. Like if you give a Nazi money, he's still a Nazi. He's just a Nazi that's bought by the feds. Now, the issue that comes into play here is when you're a private organization doing that. Because I was researching this, the FBI did pay to use an example, they paid a Satanist neo-Nazi like millions of dollars over years to use him as an informant. And, that's part of the information gathering process. Now, the real problem comes when that person does something illegal or uses it to, further their own agenda, which is what seems to happen in this case. The SPLC gave people within the National Vanguard, which is one of the main organizations at Charlottesville, they gave them money as a, presumably, I mean, I'm sure there's an element of like the nonprofit grifting going on here too, but presumably I'm going to assume there are legitimate people in the SPLC that do care about this, that do want to gather information. However, when you give that money to neo-Nazis, they're going to use it to do neo-Nazi things like recruit and then, organize a group. So you have a situation where the National Alliance, the National Vanguard, was basically a doubt organization. And I think you could see this with like a lot of the Klan organizations. Like even if you look at the hate map, which I was scrolling earlier today, if you scroll the wheel back to 2000 and then you scroll in now, most of these organizations are essentially defunct. Like I really wouldn't say, I would say that any kind of like hate extremism is much more online concentrated and like decentralized now. Like the age of like the organized KKK chapters and like tiki torches and all that kind of stuff, that really died with Charlottesville. Like that, even though that was the Unite the Right rally, but it really killed a lot of that momentum, I think. And that's why you don't see as much of it on the streets anymore.
Yeah.
Back to my original point. When the SLC gave money to individuals within the hate groups, the problem comes because they're using this money to further their organization's goals. So it's just prolonging something that would have probably died out regardless. Like they would have been run out of money, they would have gone bankrupt, and then the organization collapsed. But you have the SPLC inadvertently bankrolling the organizations that they're claiming to be fighting.
Right. So
I don't think so. I have to disagree with that.
I have a question, Kevin. So these informants, are they people who are in the organization, or do they pay people to enter the organization?
Right. That's the main issue. For the most part, it seems like most informants are people that are already in the organization.
Okay.
My understanding is that, and I read the indictment, and my understanding of the indictment is that they sought out certain individuals, not one, not two, several individuals, to pay them to do what they do best in their role as a hate monger, for lack of a better word. And it was intentional.
Okay.
And I go back to,
I think that's the main argument here.
It was intentional.
And that's what the government is alleging. Of course, we still have a lot of process to, still a lot of discovery to figure out exactly how this process went down. Because again, who were the informants? How did they end up there? Why were they there? What was the rationale? There's still a lot to discover, but it's either way. What I'll quickly say is, and you can get back to your point, David.
Okay.
And no matter what the reason for the money ending up there is, whether it is, pure malice or pure incompetence, either way, any kind of goodwill with the organization will almost certainly be destroyed by the end of this.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't think you can consider them in the same breath when you say, in the same breath as the FBI has informants. I think these individuals were collaborators that the SPLC used to, again, allegedly, and this is a grand jury returning the indictments, 11 indictments, allegedly these collaborators were used to foment what they do best, and this gave the SPLC, and if you look at the numbers at the Charlottesville, their fundraising shot up, and not just the SPLC, but other organizations like the SPLC that relies on data that they collect, information that they have to fundraise on. Again, going back to Sean's, the Grift, not-for-profit Grift, and this is prevalent in the non-profit world, the NGO world, and homelessness, mental illness, BLM. You need a boogeyman in order to sustain yourself. And the SPLC was facing some hard times before Charlottesville. And after Charlottesville, their coffers were filling up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'd like to bring in that local focus in a little bit.
Here we go.
And also because what David and I are specifically talking about here is the fact that the fight against homelessness is helmed by nonprofits in the area who donate to political campaigns very frequently. And this is a publicly known activity that they do. So they receive government monies and then they donate the money back to the government essentially, or back to the individuals because they go for their individual campaigns within the government. And by and large, they have not been effective. And that is kind of an issue, when you look at it, like people are making their careers off of these issues, right? What happens if you actually succeed in your mission and actually solve the problem? You're not going to get donations anymore. And you made your career based on it. Over-reliance on NGOs to solve the big issues is a liability. It always has been a liability. And I hope the takeaway, I know this is going to be very optimistic of me, but I hope the takeaway from this story isn't, some culture war, see left is bad or right is good or whatever, but rather the fact that private entities oftentimes are not the best equipped to handle really big problems because solving them means their own destruction. They're almost incentivized to keep the issues at least alive in a little bit while, doing whatever basically hacking at the ankles of the problem rather than taking it head on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is my core argument is that even though what the I don't know yet. I don't know what was going on with that. I'm gonna wait and see. That's my perspective on it. I would definitely want to follow this investigation fully to see what else comes up. But as far as the harm is done, what the intentions were behind the organization is irrelevant because at the end of the day, people died because extremists were getting money funneled to them by an organization that's supposed to fight them. So I think that's the core problem here. I
think intent does matter, particularly for Heather Hellier. The Southern Poverty Law Center could have some culpability in her death. So, I think intent does matter here. And when you look at the fraud that's alleged in California, in Illinois, and Minnesota, Minneapolis particularly, with NGOs and nonprofits, Americans are becoming more aware that where there's fire, or where there's smoke, there's fire. And I hate to use an analogy like that. However, they're becoming more and more aware that perhaps there should be greater oversight over the use of the funds, whether it's an organization like BLM or SPLC, or a government agency like USAID.
I mean, I just want to jump back in. I apologize. My connection has been quite rocky, but listening to what everybody was saying, the big question here is what happens to that money, right? And that is, hundreds of millions of dollars that the SPLC is raising, and it goes, to wonder, as David was saying, the oversight here. I think that this has been a year of a lot of dismantling and reckoning and sort of uncovering behind the shadows, behind the scenes, a lot of what's been happening, spanning years and years. And it's important that the American public has full transparency um, into issues like this. I remember the SPLC, and this goes back into like when I was in my middle school years, and I had to do a project um, on a social justice issue. And I chose immigration and um, defense of immigrants, but against illegal immigration. And that was in like 2017, 2018. But anyway, the SPLC came up as one of the sources cited or a source to look into. And they were always revered as this trustworthy sort of like defense fund, and they are the ones to go to for the hate maps, and they are the ones to go to for they know it, they're with it, and they are on our side. And there was sort of a bias there too with the teachers like recommending that as like the trustworthy source. But it just goes to show like the blind faith that we have to organizations like this, and the blind faith that people had to organizations like BLM. And I just urge people not to trust organizations, especially something that mm, there where we don't have that full transparency and actually knowing where that money goes to. Because beyond celebrities like George Clooney, right? Countless tech companies, banks, and payment processors, um, Tim Cook, George Soros, use the SPLC designation to censor and debunk conservative voices. You have many elites, many establishment, many in the financial institutions, donating to the SPLC. And so I asked panel, does this indictment open the door for massive class action lawsuits from the people the SPLC targeted?
Maybe. I think, like David said, intent will matter on this, right? How much of this was incompetence, how much of this was malice, as well as how much of, to what extent was their contributions legal? Because I'm not actually too sure about, and again, I think intent will really color it a lot, but potentially, and yeah, I think there's an opportunity for that, but I think there's a lot of discovery that needs to happen before we know for sure whether that can happen or not. But certainly that's on the table.
I mean,
I think
okay, I'm sorry.
I think from like a funding perspective, like that's the most interesting thing with this whole situation. Is like, how were these funds used? Like you said with Heather Hare, do we know if that gentleman that committed that murder was recruited through materials that might have been produced with SPLC money? Like that's an important question to figure out here. Because, again, if it was a defunct organization, if it was dying and the SPLC like injected, a stimulus check essentially into a neo-Nazi organization, and then they recruited an unstable individual who then, used the funds that created the circumstances for the Unite the Right rally in the first place, and then, that there is responsibility there because their actions would have led to her death. And I think there's definitely an element of, I agree with Kellen. I think there's a wait and see element. I really do think this will be a pretty extensive investigation. I think it just dropped a couple of days ago, and I think there's just so much more to find with this. And I'm definitely gonna be following this one pretty closely.
Yeah. This is going to be a big one.
Bombshell.
David, the New York Post and others drop names. JP Morgan is on the list of SPLC backers. This is, a massive financial institution with entire departments dedicated to compliance and risk management. So how does a bank that will freeze an average citizen's account for a suspicious $500 transaction miss the fact that they were funding an organization now indicted for money laundering and funneling millions to extremists? I don't think it's any sort of coincidence.
I think it is.
I agree. It's not a coincidence. And, you have an organization like SPLC or any nonprofit. You set up a PAC where you can direct money to donations to that PAC. And for some PACs, there are different reporting requirements from state to state. Depending on the size, depending on its use. Some donors are shielded. Donors to a nonprofit are typically anonymous and not reported. So 501c3 lawyers out there, accountants out there, please fact check me. However, I could give $100 to SPLC, and they create a super PAC, and they take that money that I donated and ship it to the super PAC, which I believe is illegal. I don't know. Lawyers and accountants, fact check me. Everyone do your own damn research. And they use that money in that PAC to do what they did with the collaborators or the informants as alleged in the indictments. And we're talking about, for one individual, $1 million was sent their way over the course of approximately 10 years. $100,000 on average over 10 years, you could do a whole lot with that.
Oh, yeah.
And so, again, intent does matter. And I'm sure that, as this moves forward, if it does move forward, depending on who's assigned, the judge assigned to this case, we'll see, hopefully, how that money was used and learn more about why it was used. But again, the indictments are nefarious in nature.
Yeah. I want to contribute to the question about like JP Morgan, whatnot. I think it is a coincidence. What I think the case is when an organization is looking to donate to nonprofits, they're looking for something to put up on their portfolio to show that they support relevant causes, right? It's the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, it does more than just the hate maps, right? It has a big umbrella of things that it does. And what JP Morgan and many others saw, assuming that David's theory, of them, using them to donate to political campaigns isn't true, because that could be true. It might not be true. I don't think either of us really know for sure. I think what would have happened was that they looked at the various outputs from the SPLC and decided that they were doing something right? Because there are a lot of outputs that were from there. And when an organization is that big, how much? What is the SPLC budget? I'm going to look for last year's budget report. Last year, they had $787 million. And what's being alleged here by the DOJ is about 10, right? Yes, it's a lot of money, but we got to look relative here, right? Maybe $10 million in an organization worth almost $800 million is very easy to not notice, right? If it only had $30 million budget, yeah, that'd be impossible to not notice. But with that big of a budget, I think it's completely possible to just not notice that. And I'm guessing that is what happened with most of these bigger companies that were donating to SPLC. They just wanted to show that they were supporting important social causes, and failed to recognize that because details like that often do slip through.
But there has to be an accountability here. OpenAI, for instance, was in the records. This company building the AI models that will ultimately dictate our own future, and they're considered, what they consider is truth and safety and hate speech on the internet for, decades to come. And if OpenAI is financially backing an organization that allegedly paid to manufacture a white supremacist rally, how can we trust any algorithm or moderation tool they produce, right? And
You
also,
can't.
you can't, but then the trust is broken. The trust is broken, and $10 million may go missing in an organization, but there are people within that organization whose sole responsibility is keeping track of that money. I mean, it's like if they were, it's like the Smalling daycare. It's like this doesn't just oopsie daisy. Like there's responsibility, and you're ultimately severing the public's trust time and time and time again. And it gets to a point, and this is not an organization run by a bunch of 5-year-olds, right? So, or maybe it is, right? It's it's like it's not a coincidence. It's in my opinion definitely manufactured, and they got caught.
I mean, again, we'll see exactly what the intent was, but there's definitely some leader. At best, it seems like the leadership and the SPLC was way too overconfident and misplaced and mismanaged what they were doing, and inadvertently caused the problem they were hoping to fight. And at worst, they were trying to keep the issue alive in order to keep themselves alive. Either way, it doesn't reflect well on them. And I think if you're looking at models like ChatGPT or those algorithms, I actually think that this would actually be pretty low on the totem pole of reasons to not trust a lot of those algorithms. By their very nature, they've always had difficulties. I mean, remember, we kind of did it. We kind of played it for jokes in our generation, but the amount of ways that we would try to convince the ChatGPT and other AI algorithms to try to not make something in a racist vein, and then it would still make it anyways. Like, for example, when you say generate a joke we did often, this was like, I think 2024 would be like, hey, generate me an image of a white man robbing a convenience store, and it would put a black man wearing a white mask. There's always it's algorithms like that are always trained on a massive data set, and those will always cause problems regardless of what they donate to. And again, I think this is going to be a shock to a lot of organizations donating to SPLC.
That's not really the relevance here.
Sure.
I mean,
I know it's not. I thought I'd just add that on a little bit.
I think it's more of open AI, of course. Like, they can't be trusted for a multitude of reasons. Just like,
Amen.
I'm not saying that's what reason, but
Especially
I'm saying it. Right. I know that's a whole separate topic that we could do. But it's more of, that's another like tick, right? And so something where
Another thing.
the systems, are definitely off. But when major people behind these systems are donating to, we know these people have connections, right? Like, for example, George Clooney's name is front and center, and we can dismiss, the Hollywood elites.
Yeah.
But I think over the past few years, we sort of uncovered how entwined Hollywood and tech and all these different industries are to the government. They love to buy this moral superiority by writing checks to these legal rights you mentioned. Oh, we're donating to relevant causes. It's as a banner of their morals, but it's fun for them, and usually they don't do any homework. So we're going to make an excuse for them to even do the homework behind these organizations. So now that DOJ, I would say G or J says the SPLC was cutting checks to the KKK.
Sure.
Do these people just scrub their association with the SPLC, or do they close ranks and pretend this indictment is, a right-wing witch hunt, like an article suggested? It's vindictive.
Oh, sure. A certain part of our legacy media is calling it on certain words, a witch hunt. However, I want to make this clear. I'm going to use a story in doing so. SPLC is using and following a template that has been used for years upon years upon years. The most egregious example, as far as the government template, is USAID. That's the most egregious at government level.
Could you elaborate? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. So USAID was a former government institution
Yeah.
that was established to, of course, do the goodwill in aid across the world and help other countries, other demographics and societies be better, for lack of a better word or lack of a better term. And what we found was that a lot of the money that government tax dollars that went to USAID instead went to NGOs who had connections with the administration at that time when the money was given to them, and let's just call it the way it is. What the Trump administration is alleging, the Biden and Obama administrations more recently, they had ties with insiders who funded these NGOs, these just huge salaries for the NGO operators and executives, and very little money found its way to the people who needed it the most. A lot of that money went to, folks in that particular government of that country that we're helping. On the side note, I recommend that everyone read Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It lays everything out on the grander scale, international scale, in regards to what we're talking about, and the use of NGOs to pretty much fund illicit activity. But back to my example with the SPLC, what they're using the template that has been used year after year, decade after decade, and Confessions of an Economic Hitman will demonstrate this. Here's an example locally at our Church Street office. A couple of years ago, sat down with one of our business partners, and we were looking at addressing at the micro level, business level, the homelessness situation in payroll. Some of the businesses were affected because homeless people were sleeping in the vestibules of their buildings. People could not get in and out of their offices or their businesses because there's someone laying there. We did a blog post in the Orlando Voice piece on this.
Yeah.
And we met with 3 nonprofits, NGOs, Orlando nonprofits, and say, hey, we have a plan where the businesses will take on the responsibility that the city and the county has failed to do in addressing the homelessness situation. And we'll like your nonprofit to assist us. And as we were discussing the plans, we were stopped mid-discussion and asked, well, could this possibly affect the grant money that we get from Buddy Dyer in the city of Orlando?
Yes. Yeah.
It was an emphatic yes.
Yes.
Said we're going to, and the 3 individuals said, thank you. We're going to end the conversation here. And they were a group of nonprofits that did stuff in the community with children, with poor families, whatever, that general intent to help the community. And they stopped the conversation. And they said, thank you, but, this is going to jeopardize our well-being and, our ability to serve our community.
And this is why, again, a lot of these organizations are just not equipped to handle these big issues, because if they actually solve them, then they lose their way of life. And then what comes after that, right? That's why they're not equipped. That's why, this constant trust in outside organizations, and you see this on all levels of government, but just in general, is relentless trust in outside organizations. It's just misguided.
Homelessness in the city of Orlando has grown over the last 25 years. That just so happens to be the same amount of time, approximately, that Mayor Buddy Dyer has served as mayor of Orlando.
Yeah,
and many of these, whether it's United Way, Up Orlando, or these smaller NGOs, nonprofits, or the churches in certain neighborhoods and communities. The churches are also part of this.
I can take a guess at maybe some of those organizations that you had mentioned, David, and we'll definitely talk about that because I do have something to say after this episode. But I think, we can point to the pharmaceutical industry as an example of if they actually heal people, then they're done, right? I mean, I think that when you look at these organizations, the SPLC, took in $106 million donating cash, according to latest available financial disclosures, yet they still run urgent appeals for emergency cash, right? So they have so much cash, but we're in emergency mode. We need more, we need more, we need more. And, you look at Buddy Dyer and you say, why is the homelessness situation not solved yet? Why is the homelessness situation not solved in California? Why is it not solved in New York? And you wonder, but it's like you don't really have to wonder that much. And I think all agree, especially our mission at JN Washington, and something that we all, I think, agree on is you have to look within your local community and see what you can solve and be active within your local community and the government around you, not even just at a national level. Because, for example, when I was at the No Kings protest a few months back, and we went, downtown Orlando in front of City Hall, Trump bad, Orange Man bad, and it was the same like mindset, like at a constant, like little robot. But as soon as I mentioned Buddy Dyer and maybe some issues, it was like shut down mode, like, I don't know, or that's not relevant. But it is relevant. Don't you live in Orlando? And so if you want these chains, their favorite word, systematic. From a systematic level, we start locally. I think that you can solve a lot by putting pressure on these politicians. And if you're just going to turn a blind eye to them, because I don't choose to believe that the majority of people are dumb. Maybe that's just me saying that to be nice now. Maybe they actually are because they're just turning a blind eye, but they really are. But what happens, you're an adult and I think they know somewhere deep down that these organizations, these people cannot be trusted. But because they are just such in a funnel of basic like ideology that is being told from the top down, there's no originality. And so putting blind faith into your mayor, putting blind faith into these organizations gets nowhere. And I think that's my
problem. That's a problem nationwide. Sorry to cut you off. That's a problem nationwide. When you look at what government officials people trust, people trust their local officials dramatically more than their state and federal ones. But the reality is, a lot of times, they're not really any better nor worse, right? You need to have the same kind of scrutiny and involvement with your local government. People, I think, just trust them because it's convenient. That's my thought.
I mean, I think that, you have to look into... Again, you can't have blind faith, and I think that people would have learned that lesson by now. I mean, these claims go back to 2014, I believe. We had Margaret, oh my God, I can't even speak. Margaret Huang as the CEO of the SPLC, and she resigned in July 2025. So almost a year ago, citing a desire to prioritize family life. Okay. So, I mean, we don't know. These people have known about this for decades, and they know about it before this, the shoe drops and everything just goes
to
the dumpster. I think that we have to learn our lessons here at a certain point and not be surprised when this stuff happens, because I'm not surprised. I saw it, you know, in the news, and I was like,
Just disappointed.
And think to yourself, would if the SPLC acknowledged upfront that the money was going from the nonprofit to the PAC, and that money was going towards these collaborators, informants, do you think their donors would react differently or react in a way where all this could have been avoided? I think so. I really do.
I think they would have reacted very differently. I think your fellows at Chase Bank or anybody else would have reacted very differently, because they would have recognized the time bomb of it, right? Or the huge risk, because again, they're looking for safe investments. It would not have been a safe investment if this was something that they were upfront and honest about. And I think that's why they weren't, because I think they knew. I mean, they obviously knew, at least at the very least, that this was a hazardous operation that had a ton of risk. And again, at worst, they were being malicious and trying to, do the opposite of what they were trying to do. But no, I think the same goes for the many, many people that work there. How many employees did they have? Let me remember how much that is. So, how many employees do they have? How many do they have? Almost 500. Almost 500 people that work there. I think many of them wouldn't want to work for a place that does something like that. I think most of them wouldn't. But again, I think the leadership is trying too hard to secure their money, or trying too little to actually combat their issue. One of those two is happening.
Right. And this happens across, the political spectrum. All I ask is just transparency.
Yeah.
Show me where the money's going. And unfortunately, we do a poor job of advocating for transparency and many of our nonprofit rules and laws. And that's unfortunate, because we have situations like this. We have situations that are like this in Minnesota, again, Chicago, LA, anywhere. We've got a situation with Act Blue, the fundraising software for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just asking for transparency and honesty.
and do you have anything to add?
Was that addressed to me? You cut out for a second.
Yeah, sorry, just the episode. We'll
Okay.
be wrapping the
Yeah.
episode, and
Yes.
All right, yeah. I think you could even, obviously we don't have a whole lot of time, but I think you could even talk about like the general trend of any institution that's developed to solve a problem kind of being corrupted by the problem that's caused, because you have to find a reason to exist. You could tie this back to even like the local like UCF level. Like as a UCF student, there's problems on our campus that don't get fixed, and they don't get fixed for a reason. And the reason is because there's donors, there's money, there's campus organizations that have a vested interest in continuing the problems they claim to solve. Like I think that's the fundamental issue that's being that this is going to blow up into. And this is just a further evidence of is that it's on us as the people to keep these organizations accountable, because they fundamentally have it in their interest to prolong issues rather than solve them.
Yeah.
I think that brings it all together. I think this topic is one that hopefully most people can all come to a sort of common understanding of. And we may have our disagreements on the finer details of things or how we word things, but overall, we can recognize that this here is a total breakdown of public trust, and it's not vindictive to go after or to look into investigate these organizations as some in the media may suggest. It's something that is the responsibility of the media, the responsibility of donors, to the responsibility of us, and I'm sure there's more to come, and I think it's an interesting case, and I'm not surprised by it. I'm sure it won't be the last, and I think there's many more details to come out of this. So
Sure. Yeah. Stop donating to these organizations. That's a safe bet.
I would say the same. Why would you even donate in the first place? But
yeah, don't donate to organizations. Just pay your taxes. Probably a better use of your money, to be honest.
That's, again, I don't think taxes are a great use of money, but we'll see.
I think it's not the best, but I think we definitely see some more.
Say which one is more. But anyway, I just want to thank everybody for joining this special edition of the King Exchange. I want to apologize for my connection issues, but I'm sure that the panel continued on the conversation nonetheless. And David, Kellen, and Kevin, thank you so much for joining. As always, check out the T8020 community, and check out all of the other shows on the Jay in Washington Network YouTube channel. We have great programming and many more topics to come, many more interesting interviews, hopefully, being set up here on the King Exchange. There is some things behind the works, and I'm excited. So again, thank you so much to everyone, and don't trust these organizations and don't donate to them.